If you're going to worship these ideals for their own sake, with no totally detached from what they were there to protect in the first place, detached from the outcome they're supposed to be leading to, then you really have no leg to stand on to complain about the Satan clubs.
One of the reasons I really wanted to have this conversation, I don't know if you guys follow much in the way of politics from political Twitch, or political YouTube, or the larger content creators, but one of the big things that everybody's talking about right now is pedophilia. And one of the reasons that they're discussing it is because there's a character who's kind of come in on the scene who has begun to discuss his MAP ideology, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's minor attracted persons is what that stands for. They have their own sites, they have their own everything. And what the thought process is for this is that just because I think about being attracted to a child doesn't actually make me a pedophile. They're trying to make it seem like you have to actually do the action in order to be one. And this is beginning to launch more and more into the mainstream. And it's all about thought process, right? So I think about doing this, but I don't. So therefore, I'm not a bad person. That seems to me to be exactly in line with these intrusive thoughts that we're discussing. And yet here we see it being played out in real time. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, Father Ananias.
Yeah, I just want to qualify too. Brother Augustine had spoken on it, but it's a good to make a clarification distinction that there are those thoughts that are not sins, and there's thoughts that actually are. So it's not simply, the sin occurs like when we're talking about the 5 stages, when you actually act on it. So that, Andrew, this is responding to you. The best way to think about it is, and Michael is correct in this, that the intrusive thoughts in themselves as they come as assaults are not sins. However, here's a good analogy. You can't help if a bird lands in your hair or head, but you can't help if it makes a nest there. You're responsible for it making a nest. You're responsible for the demons making a nest, because there's a difference between me getting intrusive thoughts and then me going, I'm going to play with that. I'm going to give it a little visualization. Like Michael had said, you don't immediately try to get it out of your hair, to get it out of your head. Then you're actually taking an internal action that you're responsible for. And if you got to think about it in terms of energies, there are divine energies. There's also demonic energies. The demons require energy to get power, both in their assault against you and over your life. And they require your energy. They have no creative element whatsoever. So they're pulling from the image of God in you and your creative powers. And that's really what sin is misdirected divine energy. And the demons are trying to do that. They're trying to kind of do like these jiu-jitsu, where they're taking your power and they're misdirecting it because they have no creative power themselves. So the more that you engage, the more you visualize and stuff like that, they're gaining strength and you're losing strength. They're vampiric, aren't they? They will suck the life force out of you. And so, yes, it's when you engage, when you let them make a nest, when these pedos are fantasizing about that, it is sin.
That there's a failure from anybody to try to present any sort of argumentation against this idea that it's okay to have these things in the world of fantasy. And because they're in the world of fantasy and you're not enacting them, therefore you're some type of moral person, or you shouldn't be ostracized for it, or you shouldn't be villainized for it. And yet, from my perspective, it seems that you are responsible to a large degree for your thoughts, and that you should take responsibility for those as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, Father. You go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, part of this, it's almost kind of like the libertarian arguments. There is, people, they're very reductive. So as long as I'm not violating the law, right, or the consensual agreement or something like that. So everything, like now morality and sin is all just defined in terms of positive law, man's law of like action. So we reduce all ethics and morality to positive man-made law. Well, it's very secular, but we know that it's, wait a minute, the only reason why something would be law within man's world, positive law within the state, is in as much as it reflects natural and divine law. So yes, simply because you're not going to get a ticket or get arrested for doing something within the public sphere doesn't mean that it's not immoral or a sin. And it's just kind of generally modernity has taken this reductive approach that it reduces everything to the political sphere. There is nothing that exists beyond that. And that's just a hallmark of kind of modernity. And I think we're seeing that today.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, Christ says, if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. So if you looked at a child with lust, like these people you're talking about, well, you are kind of a pedophile, right? Because the word itself means you have a philia of love. Yeah. Right. So you technically are, according to what the word means. Now, is it a crime to have a thought or a fantasy? No, not in and of itself. Does that mean it's not corrosive to your soul? Of course not. And I think if someone has made a whole identity out of defending this idea of, oh, I want to do this to kids, but I haven't done it yet. First of all, like, do you want applause for that? Like, you weren't supposed to do that to kids. It's like I was watching Always Sunny the other day, which I haven't seen in a long time. And Max says, I'm an anti-racist. And no one claps. He goes, why aren't you guys applauding for me? They're like, well, why would we applaud for you not being a racist? You're not supposed to be a racist. He goes, well, then why did I do this? It's almost like a way of virtue signaling, but that's not something I'm going to applaud for. The fact that you didn't harm any children today, that's kind of should be the default. Now, if someone's made a whole, and I don't watch Twitch and I don't follow all this stuff, but I think if someone's made an identity out of the fact that they have really vicious, violent, like felonious thoughts, but haven't quite acted on them yet, should you arrest the person? I don't know, but an ankle bracelet probably wouldn't hurt. You should certainly be on a list. You should be supervised. Back in the day. Yeah, there you go. We already have them built, right? I know back in the day, I mean, if a priest touched a child, according to St. Basil the Great, not only was the person defrocked, not only were they shamed in public, like put in shackles for the public to throw stuff at, but they were then supervised by 2 other men for the whole rest of their lives, just to make sure they wouldn't offend again. Obviously, if you look at what's happened in the Latin sect, they don't follow that canon quite so much anymore. They seem to promote and protect them, but that's neither here nor there. But it's a symptom of how bad our society has gotten that people feel comfortable saying stuff like that in the first place. I mean, a couple hundred years ago, you'd probably be hanged just for saying that, right? Just for saying, oh, these are some thoughts I have. The rest of the guys would be like, okay, well, just to be sure, here's a nice tree for you. They certainly wouldn't allow them to talk about it openly on the internet. And I had this big post on Gab yesterday and on Telegram talking about the logical endpoint of free speech and toleration, because Tucker Carlson just had an interview with, I think his name was Lucian Graves. It's the head of like the Temple of Satan or something. Yeah. And Graves made a really interesting point that I thought was correct in that interview. He said, well, he's pointing, I'm paraphrasing, that conservatives are hypocrites. They worship free speech and religious tolerance, but then they get upset when there's an after-school Satan club for kids. And I thought he's actually right about that. If you're going to worship these ideals for their own sake, with totally detached from what they were there to protect in the first place, detached from the outcome they're supposed to be leading to, then you really have no leg to stand on to complain about the Satan clubs. But if you're going to have free speech and all this stuff, you can't get upset when these, what do you call them, MAP people start talking. You have to have free speech only as an ideal to get to something, which should be the moral and physical health of society, right? So we can't have an ideal just for the sake of it there. Like a lot of conservatives worship the Constitution just because it happens to be a piece of paper with words on it, with no thought whatsoever as to how it's played out over time. 200 years from empire to the end is not a particularly successful experiment in governance, in my opinion. But there's no reason why people like this should be allowed to share these thoughts publicly and feel safe about it. I mean, that's the scariest part, is that they feel safe saying this, or else they wouldn't.
Well, the arguments that are put forward by the people who are advocates for this style of belief is that, wouldn't you rather have these thoughts out in the open so that you know who's having them, so that they can be treated or that they can be taken care of or things like that? I don't know if that's the best solution, rather than teaching people instead to guard their thoughts, so that these, what we would call intrusive thoughts, or what you called, it started with an L, I'm sorry.
Logisme.
Yeah, logisme. These intrusive thoughts. Wouldn't it be better instead to train your mind away from them, rather than us trying to push towards some type of bizarre society where we can just all pop up and say, yeah, you know, I fantasize about 11-year-olds. Right?
Yeah, and you know, it's a slippery slope, because then obviously the slippery slope is not a fallacy. It's happened a lot in our society. Eventually, oh, I'm thinking about it but not doing it will turn into, well, maybe the kid was 11, but hey, at least he wasn't 10, right? I'm not a monster. He wasn't 10 years old. That's where this is heading.
It's always a slippery slope. By the way, here's the litmus test for these people. Ask them if they'd be encouraging racist thoughts. Why did that, darn it?
That's a good point.
Yeah, that like, well, isn't it better that it be out in the open? There's always something, a counterexample, a defeater that you can find that they have some sort of standard, right? It's incorrect, but you can use that to defeat their argument. But I was just thinking too about the demonic, and I know, Michael, you and I have talked about this too. I mean, think about the underlying kind of message, freedom, and you spell that F-R-E-E-D-U-M-B. It is satanic itself. It is Luciferian. You should be free to do whatever you want. You should be free to, don't you want to also have the knowledge of good and evil? Shouldn't you be free? It's just this message over and over again. And so unbridled, first, there is a notion of like freedom within orthodoxy, right? But it's paradigm relative. It's condition. It doesn't mean unbridled freedom. It's free from sin. It's free from passions and different stuff like this. But we have no concept within our theology of that freedom in and of itself is some virtue that should be celebrated. And it really, that's always been a temptation and message of the devil.
No, if you look at political freedom, I mean, they never use their freedom to build more churches. They build their freedom, or they use their freedom to do libertarian stuff instead. It's always used in service of evil. You know, you look at the guys who were in the communist prisons in Patesti, they were in the worst conditions on earth, and that made saints out of them, you know?
Yeah.
And some of them said after they were freed, they were never as close to God as they were when they were being tortured in prison. So this idea of political freedom has nothing to do with the soul. Like you're saying, real freedom is virtue.